The winter wind cuts differently on the open prairie. It doesn't swirl like it does in timber country. It doesn't pause or soften around hills or trees. It moves flat, uninterrupted, scraping heat from anything that dares stand above the grass. In the Dakota Territory, winter doesn't arrive with ceremony. It arrives with subtraction. Heat is taken away. Strength is tested. Mistakes are exposed. And many settlers learned that lesson the hard way in the early 1870s, arrived with confidence built on advice printed hundreds of miles east, advice that had worked well enough in Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin. They believed winter was something you could overpower. With strong stove, enough fuel, and sturdy boards underfoot, the prairie corrected that belief quickly. One homesteader woke before dawn to find thin skin of ice creeping across his cabin floor 3 feet from glowing iron stove. Another discovered his wash water solid by morning despite keeping fire banked through the night. Across the territory, families scraped frost from floorboards with spoons, not because they were careless, but because their houses were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. They were letting the cold in. At first, no one blamed the house. They blamed the wind. They blamed the fuel. They blamed the severity of the season. But winter after winter, the pattern repeated itself with cruel consistency. Built by the book, burned through cord after cord of precious wood and hay, yet still felt hostile to live in. Children slept on raised pallets to escape the cold radiating upward. Adults kept boots on indoors. Mornings began with stiffness, numb fingers, and breath fogging in rooms that were never meant to feel like the outdoors. The prairie was not just cold, it was stealing heat, quietly, continuously, and without mercy. What most settlers failed to recognize was that the cold they were fighting did not come from the sky alone. It rose from beneath their feet. It flowed through open spaces under their floors. They gathered strength in the void between the house and the ground, turning crawl spaces into reservoirs of winter. The accepted wisdom of the day insisted this was necessary. Raise the house to keep it dry. Let air circulate beneath the floor. Keep earth and dampness at distance. On paper, it made sense. On the prairie, it created perfect machine for heat loss. Wind-driven snow packed under cabins and stayed there for months, never melting. Open air beneath the floor became frozen chamber that fed cold upward into the living space day and night. No stove, no matter how large, could fully overcome house designed to bleed warmth into the groundless void below it. The stove fought gravity. The floor fought physics. The family paid the price. This was the moment when the prairie began to teach its first lesson, not through theory, but through consequence. Among those watching and enduring was quiet a farmer named Johann Bauer. He did not arrive intending to innovate. He arrived intending to survive. Like many others, his first shelter followed the advice of land agents and lumber catalogs that looked respectable. It looked modern, and it failed in exactly the same way as the rest. But Bauer noticed something others overlooked. While the wind howled and the floor froze, the earth beneath the cabin remained unchanged. The soil buried beneath snow and frost held temperature stubbornly. Wells stayed unfrozen deep below. Rude pits cut into hillsides resisted the worst of winter. Indigenous earth lodges, half hidden in the ground, continued to shelter families long after surface cabins became unbearable. Winter, Bauer realized, was not strongest in the area. It was strongest where the house had chosen not to be. That understanding would not come all at once. It would arrive slowly, shaped by observation, memory, and failure. But this first winter carved the question into his mind with more clarity than any pamphlet ever could. What if the house, losing not because it lacked fire, but because it had abandoned the earth? The prairie had delivered its opening lesson, and it was only just beginning. When Johann Bauer first arrived on his claim, he did what every responsible homesteader was expected to do. He followed instructions. The advice came, printed in neat columns and confident diagrams distributed by land agents, railroad companies, and lumber yards eager to see the prairie filled with orderly farms and tidy houses. These pamphlets promised safety through speed and efficiency. Build quickly, build lightly. Raise the house off the ground so air circulate beneath it. Moisture, they warned, was the true enemy. So Bauer set his cabin on shallow stone piers, lifting the floor nearly 2 feet above the soil. Cottonwood joists spanned gaps, covered by inch-thick pine planks laid quickly before winter could close in. Beneath it all remained an open crawl space exposed to the wind from every direction, just as the diagrams recommended. It looked right, it matched the pictures, and it failed exactly the way pictures never showed. The reasoning behind this method had worked well in the wooded regions farther east, in Ohio and Illinois, where force broke the wind and snow fell deep but slow. Raised floors allowed dampness to escape and timbers to dry. Airflow was a safeguard against rot. Separation from the earth was considered progress. On the open prairie, that separation became a liability. By December, snow driven by relentless northwest winds packed itself beneath Bauer's cabin, filling the crawl space until it formed dense, frozen mess. The wind scoured the exposed ground, stealing what little heat rose from the soil and replacing it with cold air that never rested. The space beneath the floor became reservoir of winter. Inside the cabin, the iron stove worked without mercy. Bauer fed it hay and scarce cottonwood until the metal glowed dull red, yet warmth gathered uselessly near the ceiling while the floor remained hostile, radiating cold upward through every seam between the boards. Mornings were the worst. Before the stove could be stirred back to life, frost traced pale patterns along the floorboards. Water left in a basin near the wall stiffened overnight. Bauer learned to keep his boots close at hand because stepping barefoot onto planks at dawn felt like stepping onto ice. The problem was not unique to his claim. Across the township, cabins built the same way suffered the same fate. Families raised their beds on trunks and crates to escape the cold pooling near the floor. Children slept wrapped in coats, their breath visible in rooms meant to shelter them. Fuel disappeared faster than anyone had planned, hauled from distant creek bottoms at enormous effort. Yet the cold never truly retreated. The root cellar, built according to the same trusted advice, failed just as predictably. Dug shallow and placed at a distance from the house, it froze early and thawed late. Vegetables split under frost pressure. Meltwater collected in spring, turning stored food into waste before planting season arrived. These methods were not careless. They were inherited mistakes, borrowed from climates that did not behave like the Dakota Prairie. Government bulletins insisted of prevented decay. Lumber companies promoted light framing to conserve materials. County agents spoke confidently of proper ventilation, unaware that on the plains, ventilation without control was simply exposure. Johann Bauer listened, he nodded, and he paid attention. He noticed that no amount of fuel could fully overcome floor suspended in moving air. He noticed that the cold felt strongest, not near the walls or windows, but at his feet. And he noticed something else, something quieter. The earth beneath his cabin did not freeze the way the air above it did. Snow melted first, near the ground. Wells remained usable long after surface water turned solid. Even in the depth of winter, the soil held a stubborn, muted warmth that the raised cabin never touched. Bauer began to understand that the accepted wisdom had solved one problem while creating another. By lifting the house away from moisture, settlers had lifted it away from stability. By trusting airflow to protect wood, they had surrendered control of temperature. The house had become a thin shell suspended in wind, fighting winter with nothing but fire. This was not a failure effort. It was a failure of design. Johann Bauer did not argue with his neighbors. He did not announce a better way. He simply observed the pattern repeating itself across the prairie and recognized a truth that would guide every decision he made next. A house that floats above the land must fight the weather alone, and on the Dakota Prairie, that fight was never fair. Johann Bauer did not arrive at his new understanding through sudden inspiration. It came quietly through contrast. The air above his cabin changed by the hour. One day calm, the next violent. Temperatures rose and collapsed without warning, pulled by distant storms and shifting winds. But beneath his feet, the ground behaved differently. It did not react. It did not panic. It endured. During a brief January thaw, Bauer was asked to help retrieve a bucket from a neighbor's stock well. As he descended the ladder, hand over hand, he felt something that surprised him. With every few feet, the biting edge of winter softened. By the time he reached the water line, the air felt almost mild compared to the surface wind scouring the prairie above. He climbed out slowly, carrying more than just the bucket. That sensation stayed with him. Bauer remembered his childhood village along the Volga River, where houses were not perched lightly on posts, but anchored deeply into the soil. Stone cellars sat directly beneath kitchens and living rooms, their thick walls holding steady temperatures through seasons of brutal cold and relentless heat. In those houses, floors never froze. Food lasted through winter without constant attention. The earth itself shared the burden of survival. Those memories had seemed irrelevant when he first arrived in America. The prairie, after all, was supposed to be different. New methods, new science. But the land did not care what the pamphlets said. As winter wore on, Bauer paid closer attention to structures that defied the cold rather than fighting it. He noticed the remains of earth lodges near the Missouri River, their outlines softened by time but still legible to anyone willing to look. These homes, partially sunk into the ground and covered with thick layers of soil, had sheltered families for generations in a climate far less forgiving than the one now breaking so many newcomers. A Lakota carpenter working on repairs at a nearby trading post once explained in careful broken English why those lodges endured. The ground beneath them held the same temperature year-round. Heat from fires was absorbed slowly by earth and released just as slowly. Cold winds passed overhead, unable to reach the living space below. Bauer listened closely. He began to recognize the same principle at work in places settlers rarely considered. Root pits dug into hillsides stayed usable longer than those cut shallow into flat ground. Wells resisted freezing even when surface streams locked solid. Even livestock favored depressions, and cut banks during storms, instinctively seeking the muted calm close to the earth. These were not accidents. They were expressions of a rule older than any building code. Below the frost line, the earth does not follow the weather. Bauer sought confirmation from men who work with soil for a living. A Swedish well digger who had sunk shafts across 3 counties told him plainly that temperature swings faded at depth. 8 feet down, the soil barely noticed winter. 10 feet down, it held close to the region's yearly average. Cool in summer, warm in winter, and always predictable. Predictability was what Bauer lacked. In the open prairie, air could not be trusted. Wind stole heat as fast as fire could replace it. Snow reflected warmth away and fed cold back into the structure. Every raised floor surrendered control to forces that never rested. The earth, by contrast, offered resistance. Stone touching soil gained weight, stability, and thermal memory. Soil pressed against walls slowed heat loss instead of accelerating it. Structures that accepted this partnership required less fuel, fewer repairs, and less constant vigilance. The realization did not feel revolutionary. It felt obvious. Once seen, Bauer began to understand that the failure of frontier cabins was not caused by harsh winters alone, but by decision made at the very beginning. Construction settlers had chosen to separate their homes from the most stable thermal mass available to them. They had chosen air over earth. By the end of that winter, Johann Bauer no longer asked how to build stronger stove or burn more fuel. Those questions belonged to losing strategy. Instead, different question took root, one that challenged everything he had been told since arriving on the prairie. What if the house stopped floating above the land and learn? Rest within it, the answer would not come easily. It would demand deeper digging, heavier work, and the courage to ignore advice that no longer matched reality. But the earth had already given him its lesson. All that remained was whether he would trust it. Ideas do not spread easily on the frontier. Survival depends on shared knowledge, and shared knowledge hardens into rules. By the time Johann Bauer began questioning how cabins were built, those rules had already buried many winters' worth of experience beneath them. To challenge them was not simply to suggest a new method. It was to question the judgment of everyone who had come before. Bauer did not announce his conclusions. He spoke of them cautiously. Fragments at the edges of conversation, at the general store, during fence repairs, around the long table at township meetings where men compared losses more often than victories. When he suggested that the earth itself might be a source of warmth rather than a threat, the response was always the same. Silence first, then warnings. Carpenters shook their heads. They had been trained to fear dampness above all else. Wood, they said, must breathe. Elevation kept timbers sound. Digging deep beneath light frame would invite rot, collapse, and sickness. One man insisted that cellar under house would turn the floor into sponge within 2 seasons. The county land agent quoted bulletins printed back east, pages Bauer had already read by lantern light. Keep houses raised, keep cellars separate, circulation prevents decay. These represented not as opinions but as settled science. There was no malice and opposition, there was certainty. On the prairie, certainty was comforting. To build by the book meant that failure could be blamed on the land, the weather, or simple bad luck. To build differently meant failure would belong to the builder alone. Bauer understood that risk. When he marked out his new claim in the spring of 1874, he did so quietly. The outline of the cabin appeared first, a modest rectangle staked into the thawing soil. Inside it, he drove 4 more stakes, forming a square at the center. Neighbors noticed. They asked what the inner markings were for. Bauer answered plainly, a cellar, not nearby, not shallow. Under the house, the reactions were immediate. Some laughed. Others warned him he would regret it. A carpenter named deadliest, who had built more cabins in the township than anyone else, told him flatly that the floor would rot, the walls would settle, and the house would be condemned before its first winter ended. Others were less direct. Quiet bets were placed. Conversation stopped when Bauer approached. The assumption was not that he might succeed, but that he would learn painfully why the rules existed. What few understood was that Bauer was not rejecting frontier knowledge. He was questioning its origin. The accepted methods had been imported wholesale from climates with trees, hills, and reliable timber supplies. They assumed windbreaks that did not exist in winters, behaved predictably. On the prairie, wind ruled everything, and predictability was luxury no one possessed. Bauer's idea challenged the frontier's unspoken hierarchy and suggested that indigenous methods, Old World masonry, and direct observation might hold more truth than official diagrams printed hundreds of miles away. That made people uneasy, yet Bauer persisted, not stubbornly, but deliberately. He knew that if he failed, he would fail alone. No path would share the blame. No carpenter would claim responsibility. But he also knew that repeating the same methods guaranteed the same outcome. The choice before him was simple, though not easy. Trust elevation and burn more fuel every year, or trust the earth and except the labor, risk, and skepticism that came with it. By late April, when the prairie soil had thawed enough to yield to a shovel, Johann Bauer made his decision. He picked up his tools and he began to dig. Johann Bauer did not begin digging with enthusiasm. He began with precision. On the prairie, a hole dug in the wrong place became a trap. Water gathered where it should drain. Walls collapsed where soil was misunderstood. Bauer laid out his work carefully, not as a man seeking storage space, but as one anchoring a structure that would have to survive decades of frost, thaw, and wind. The cabin footprint came first. A simple rectangle, 16 feet wide and 20 long. Within that outline, Bauer centered a square excavation 12 feet on each side. This was not convenience, it was balance. The deepest earth would sit beneath the heart of the living space, while solid ground remained under the perimeter walls. The first 18 inches yielded easily rich black loam loosened by years of prairie grass. Below that, the soil changed character. Dense clay resisted the shovel. Gravel and fieldstone appeared scattered but stubborn. Each foot downward demanded more effort, more care. By 4 feet, Bauer set aside the shovel and took up pick. At 6 feet, seepage appeared along the walls as spring meltwater found its way through unseen channels. Bauer cut narrow drainage trenches sloping gently away from the excavation, guiding water toward low swell to the east. He knew better than to fight water head-on. On the prairie, survival often meant redirection, not resistance. Depth was not at random. Bauer had learned from well diggers, men whose livelihoods depended on understanding the ground. They spoke of point below which the earth stopped caring about the seasons. 8 feet down, temperatures barely shifted. By 10 feet, the soil held steady near the yearly average, immune to both summer heat and winter cold. That was the depth Bauer wanted. At 10 feet below the planned floor level, the digging stopped. What lay below was not space, it was stability. Now came the work that separated this project from every raised cabin nearby. Instead of placing scattered stone piers beneath individual joists, Bauer laid continuous foundation of fieldstone around the entire cellar perimeter. Each stone was chosen by hand, set flat and true. The wall rose from the cellar floor to just below the future floor joists, thick enough to bear weight evenly and solid enough to resist movement. This was not decorative masonry. It was load-bearing, earth-connected structure. Bauer used techniques learned long before the prairie ever touched his life. Flat stones faced outward. Smaller rock and clay filled the interior. The foundation extended below the cellar floor into undisturbed soil, anchoring the structure beneath the frost line where heaving and seasonal movement could not reach it. The cellar walls became more than containment. They became part of the house's thermal body. Stone in contact with earth absorbed a steady underground temperature and released it slowly into the enclosed space. Unlike air, which changed by the hour, stone remembered. It carried warmth forward through time. Above the stone ledge, Bauer framed upward heavy timbers, creating continuous bearing surface for the floor. There would be no isolated pressure points, no shifting piers to tilt under winter stress. Weight would be shared. Movement would be minimized. Access to the cellar mattered as much as its construction. Bauer framed straight stair descending from the northeast corner of the cabin, where the kitchen would eventually stand. The opening was large enough to move sacks and barrels, but small enough to be closed tightly. This was not a casual hatch. It was the controlled connection between two thermal worlds. Every decision served more than one purpose. The depth stabilized temperature. The stone stabilized structure. The continuous foundation stabilized both. By the time the last stones were set, Bauer had already crossed a line his neighbors believed no one should cross. He had placed his house where frontier wisdom insisted it did not belong, not above the earth. But within it, the hole he had dug was not simply a cellar. It was the beginning of a different relationship with prairie, one rooted in patience, weight, and an understanding that survival did not always mean standing higher. Sometimes it meant going deeper. The first winter after the cellar was finished arrived without ceremony. No warnings, no gradual test. Just a familiar prairie cold settling in, as it always had. Johann Bauer waited. He had built the new floor directly on the stone ledge that crowned the cellar walls. Heavy cottonwood joists rested where stone met wood, eliminating the open air that had once turned his cabin into a funnel for winter. Above them, thick pine planks formed a single surface. Nothing fancy, nothing rushed. What mattered was not how the floor looked, it was how it behaved. When December brought the first sustained cold, Bauer noticed the difference immediately. The chill still crept in through walls and windows, as it always would in frontier cabin, but the cold no longer rose from below. The floor held its ground. On mornings when the iron stove burned low, Bauer stepped out of bed expecting the familiar shock. Instead, the boards felt merely cool, firm, steady, and alive with quiet warmth that had not been there before. No frost traced the seams. No ice glazed the surface. He walked barefoot. That small act told him more than any thermometer could. Down in the cellar, the air stayed constant. Borrowed mercury thermometer showed temperatures hovering in the low 40s, even as surface world plunged well below zero. The stone walls absorbed heat when the stove ran hot during cooking hours, then released it slowly through the night. The cellar had become thermal reservoir. The floor above acted as bridge, not barrier, allowing warmth to move upward without inviting drafts. Instead of fighting gravity and airflow, the stove now worked with the structure. Heat no longer rushed uselessly toward the ceiling and settled into the mass beneath the kettle and lingered. Fuel consumption told the same story. By midwinter, Bauer realized he was burning far less wood than before. Where neighboring cabins devoured 6 cords or more to survive the season, his stove demanded closer to 4. Not because it worked harder, but because the heat it produced stayed put. The house had gained memory. Warmth from the evening meal lingered into the early morning hours. Temperature swings softened. The frantic rhythm of constant stoking gave something calmer, more deliberate. Neighbors noticed. They stepped inside expecting the same misery they lived with every day. Instead, they paused just inside the door, surprised by the absence of biting cold near the floor. Some crouched to touch the boards, pressing a palm flat as if to confirm what their bodies already sensed. The difference was not dramatic. It was decisive. Bauer did not boast. He did not explain. He knew the house was still unfinished in a deeper sense. First success solved one problem, but revealed others waiting beneath it. Drafts still crept through the plank seams. A moisture gathered where warm air met cool stone. The system worked, but it was not yet refined. Still, the most brutal flaw of prairie housing had been broken. For the first time since arriving on his claim, Johann Bauer's cabin no longer surrendered its heat to the groundless air below. The earth, once excluded, now carried part of the burden. Still ruled the prairie, but inside this house it no longer ruled alone. Success on the frontier is rarely complete. It solves one problem only to reveal another that had been hidden by failure. Johann Bauer learned this during the quiet weeks of midwinter, when the cellar did its work so well that the cabin began to behave in ways he had not anticipated. The floor no longer froze. Fuel lasted longer. Nights were easier, but the house had changed. Where once cold had rushed upward through the boards, now gentler currents moved instead. Bauer noticed them first in the evenings, seated at the table by lamplight. A faint chill brushed his ankles, not sharp enough to alarm, but persistent enough to demand attention. The floorboards told the story. Laid quickly in the rush before winter, they left narrow gaps between planks, common practice on the frontier. In the old raised cabin, those gaps had simply delivered cold. Now, over warm cellar, they allowed slow air exchange between two spaces with different temperatures. The cellar breathed into the cabin. Warm air rose through the seams, cooled near the surface, and sank again. The movement was subtle but constant. Bauer's wife noticed it first. Near the outer walls, where the floor felt cooler than the center of the room despite the stove burning strong, the problem grew clear as winter deepened. Moisture from cooking, washing, and breathing drifted downward through the floor and met the cooler stone walls below. On mild days, Bauer found beads of condensation forming on the underside of the joists when he descended into the cellar. The air smelled heavier than it should. Food storage offered another warning. Potatoes, that should have slept through winter, began to show pale shoots by February. Cabbage heads softened too quickly. The cellar had become warmer and more stable, but it had also become too still. The very improvements that had conquered the cold now threatened to undermine the system. Bauer understood that he had shifted the balance. The house was no longer leaking heat freely. That meant moisture and stale air no longer escaped by accident either. Where the old cabin had breathed through cracks and exposure, a new one held its breath. This was not flaw. It was responsibility. Built house demanded intention. Without control, warmth created discomfort instead of comfort. Stability without circulation became stagnation. The problem was not the cellar, it was the absence of design around it. Bauer began to study the cabin as whole rather than as collection of parts. He noticed how cold clung to the perimeter walls where stone met timber. He watched warm air gather uselessly near the ceiling, while cooler air lingered near the floor edges. Had gained thermal mass, but it lacked insulation at its weakest joints. Once again, the solution would not come from burning more fuel. It would come from shaping how heat and air moved through the structure. The frontier had taught Bauer its first lesson through cold, and now it offered another quieter warning. House that holds heat must also know how to release air. And if Johann Bauer wanted his cabin to endure more than one good winter, he would have to learn that just as carefully as the first. Johann Bauer did not search for solutions in books. He searched in places where winter had already been beaten. When his cabin began to show signs of imbalance, warmth without comfort, stability without breath, he looked beyond his own work and studied structures that had solved these problems long before the prairie was divided into claims The first lesson came from sod house several miles away, built low into the land, its walls cut from prairie blocks, stacked thick as man's arm as long. The house looked crude from distance. Up close, Bauer noticed something important. The interior felt calm. The walls were neither cold nor damp. They carried muted warmth that did not depend on fire alone. The builder explained simply, "Earth does not rush heat away, it holds it." Bauer paid attention to the base of the sod walls, where soil rose well above floor level, the most vulnerable part of any building. The joint between foundation and wall had been buried deliberately. Cold winds overhead, unable to reach the structure's weakest point. The second lesson came from a Norwegian neighbor who had grown up in timber country, where log houses were routinely banked with soil each autumn. Earth was piled against the lower walls and scraped away again in spring, allowing the logs to dry while protecting them from winter winds. The technique was not permanent, but it was effective. The message was clear. Cold attacked buildings from the ground up as much as from the sky down. Protect the lower walls and the whole house benefited. Bauer combined these ideas into single improvement. In the spring, once the ground softened enough to work, he dug shallow trench around the perimeter of his cabin, 18 inches deep, and sloped carefully for drainage. From unused portions of his claim, he cut prairie sod into dense, rectangular blocks and began stacking them against the foundation. Course by course, grass side down, the earth rose. The finished sod skirt stood 3 feet high against the cabin walls and sloped outward 4 feet at its base. Rain and snowmelt ran away from the structure instead of collecting at it. Beneath the sod, Bauer laid coarse gravel to carry water toward shallow ditches leading to natural ground. This was not insulation in the modern sense. It was protection. By burying the vulnerable joint where stone met timber, Bauer cut off one of winter's most efficient paths into the house. The skirt blocked wind, moderated temperature swings, and extended the earth's influence upward into the living space. Inside, Bauer addressed the floor itself. The single layer of pine planks had served its purpose, but it allowed too much movement of air. Without sealing them completely, Bauer needed to slow that exchange. He lifted sections of the floor and added second layer between the original boards and the new surface. He packed mixture of sand and fine clay, materials already present from his excavation. The fill was thickest near the outer walls, where heat loss was greatest, and thinner toward the center to preserve the thermal connection with the cellar below. Over this, he laid tight-fitting boards, planed and fitted with care. The effect was immediate. Drafts at ankle level disappeared. The floor felt heavier, more substantial underfoot. Heat moved through it slowly instead of rushing in unpredictable currents. The house no longer leaked comfort away from its edges. Bauer rearranged the interior accordingly. Work tables, seating, and evening activities clustered above the cellar, where conditions were most stable. Storage and less used spaces shifted toward the outer walls, now protected but still cooler. The house was becoming organized, not by habit but by temperature. When the next windstorm came, driving snow hard enough to rattle the walls, Bauer watched closely. The stove burned steadily but not furiously. The floor remained walkable, the cold press outside, but it did not penetrate the heart of the structure. Fuel use dropped again. More importantly, the cabin felt balanced. The earth no longer touched only the cellar walls. It had climbed partway up the house itself. By Johann Bauer's third winter, the cabin had learned how to hold warmth. What it had not yet learned was how to breathe. The improvements that sealed drafts and stabilized temperatures had also trapped something less visible. On still days, the air felt heavy. Cooking odors lingered longer than they should. In the cellar, Bauer noticed faint musty smell that spoke of moisture with nowhere to go. The warning signs were subtle but serious. Potatoes began sprouting too early. Carrots softened at the ends. Condensation appeared on cool stone surfaces during mild spells. The cellar, once too cold and leaky, now risked becoming too warm and too still. Bauer understood the danger. House that release moisture will rot from the inside long before cold can destroy it, and cellar that cannot exchange air will ruin the very food it was meant to protect. The solution, Bauer realized, was not more cracks. It was designed to airflow. He found his first clues during trading Trep to Fort Randall. The posts supplied buildings partially set into the ground, stored flour and dried goods through every season without spoilage. Bauer noticed simple wooden shafts into the walls, one low, one high. The quartermaster explained that fresh air entered near the floor and stale air escaped near the ceiling, creating slow, continuous circulation without chilling the interior. Later that winter, Bauer spoke with Lakota carpenter working on repairs near the agency buildings. The man described the same principle in different words. In hearth lodges, fresh air entered low, warmed by earth and fire, while smoke and damp air escaped through opening above. Different culture, same physics. Bauer also gained confirmation from a military circular that reached the county office not long after. Army physicians had learned the hard way that sealed barracks spread illness. Their recommendation was clear: air must enter low and exit high, with the heat source placed between to drive natural movement. By the following summer, Bauer was ready to act. He added 2 ventilation shafts to the cellar, built from carefully fitted oak planks sealed with pine pitch. The intake shaft entered near the cellar floor on the north side of the cabin, where incoming air would be cooled and tempered by contact with stone and earth before rising. Above ground, the opening was protected by a simple hood that kept out rain and drifting snow. The exhaust shaft was placed near the opposite wall, drawing air from the warmest part of the cellar ceiling. It rose through the cabin structure, passing close to the stovepipe, so that rising heat strengthened the draft. Above the roof, it extended several feet and was capped to prevent downdrafts. Both shafts were fitted with wooden damp. For the first time, Bauer could adjust the cabin's breathing. In winter, he reduced airflow to conserve heat while still allowing moisture to escape. In summer, he opened the dampers at night, flushing warm air from the cellar and locking in cool temperatures during the day. The results were unmistakable. Cellar air cleared. Condensation vanished. Vegetables stored cleanly and remained dormant through the season. Potatoes stayed firm well into spring. Losses dropped to almost compared to the spoilage Bauer had endured in his early years. The living space improved as well. Fresh air entered gently, without the shock of winter drafts. Stale air left on its own, pulled upward by warmth rather than forced out by wind. Temperatures evened out from floor to ceiling. The house felt lighter, healthier, more alive. Bauer no longer relied on chance leaks to keep his family safe. The cabin now breathed because it was designed to. Heat, earth, air, and structure had finally begun to work together, not as separate features, but a single system shaped by understanding rather than habit. The prairie does not test ideas gently. When it comes to judgment, it delivers verdicts without appeal. The morning of January 12, 1888, began like any other winter day in the Dakota Territory. The air was cool but manageable. Winds were light. Children walked to school without fear. Farmers stepped outside to tend animals dressed for routine cold, not disaster. By early afternoon, everything changed. A black wall rose on the northwest horizon, moving faster than storms were supposed to move. Within hours, temperatures collapsed more than 40 degrees. Winds screamed across the open land, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to a few steps at best. By nightfall, the prairie had become lethal. This would later be called the schoolchildren's blizzard. Storm remembered, not for its snow, but for its suddenness. Families were caught unprepared. Houses that had seemed adequate hours earlier were pushed beyond their limits. Johann Bauer was inside when the pressure hit. He closed dampers, banked the stove, and waited. The wind battered the cabin walls for more than a day and a half. Snow buried the sod skirt entirely, piling high against the structure. Outside temperatures plunged deep below zero, while wind chill made the air deadly to exposed skin in minutes. Inside, Bauer watched his system work. The cellar thermometer barely moved, holding between 38 and 40 degrees. 10 feet of earth and stone ignored the chaos above. The ventilation dampers, set for winter, allowed just enough air to circulate without surrendering warmth to the storm. Above the cellar, the floor remained steady. Not warm, but alive. The boards never dropped into the danger zone. Bauer's family moved freely in wool stockings even when the stove burned down to coals overnight. Heat from the evening fire bled slowly into the structure, stored in stone and soil, released back into the living space hour by hour. Fuel lasted. Where other cabins demanded constant feeding, Bauer's stove worked in measured cycles. Over the 36-hour storm, he burned less than half quart of wood, enough to remain safe, but not desperate. Across the prairie, the difference was brutal. Cabins built on raised piers filled with wind-driven snow beneath their floors. Crawl spaces became ice chambers. Floors radiated cold so severe that families piled straw, furniture, and blankets onto tables to escape it. Stoves glowed red while breath still fogged the air. Some houses stayed standing, but were no longer livable. Root cellars froze solid. Stored food split, burst, and rotted. Frost heave shifted shallow foundations, cracking walls and throwing doors out of square. When the storm finally broke, damage revealed itself slowly and relentlessly. Johann Bauer's cabin showed none of it. The continuous stone foundation remained level. The sod skirt had insulated the weakest joints when the wind was at its worst. The cellar protected the food supply completely. When Bauer opened the cellar door days later, the air was cool, clean, and unchanged. The storm had tested every assumption settlers carried onto the prairie. It punished elevation, it rewarded depth. It exposed the difference between fighting winter and stepping out of its way. When neighbors gathered afterward to compare losses, Bauer did not lecture. He did not claim victory. He listened, but the argument was over. The prairie had spoken with enough that no pamphlet, no diagram, and no tradition could contradict it. A house that stood apart from the earth stood alone. A house that rested within it endured. Nothing about Johann Bauer's cabin was miraculous. There were no secret materials, No lost inventions, no genius breakthrough hidden from history. What survived the prairie survived because it obeyed rules older than any frontier manual. The earth below the frost line does not panic. Stone does not forget heat once it has absorbed it. Air if left uncontrolled will always betray you. Bauer's house endured not because it fought winter harder than its neighbors, but because it refused to fight winter at all. It chose stability over resistance, depth over elevation, control over exposure. The frontier rewarded that choice. Raised cabins failed not from lack of effort, but from misunderstanding where danger truly lived. Cold did not simply fall from the sky. It rose from below, fed by, amplified by empty space, and delivered directly into the living quarters. Every inch of open air beneath floor became corridor. For heat to escape, Bauer closed that corridor. By coupling his house to the earth, he turned the ground into thermal ally. The cellar became more than storage. It became buffer, battery, and stabilizer. Stone walls absorbed warmth during moments of abundance and returned it slowly during scarcity. The sod skirt shielded the most vulnerable joints. The double floor moderated movement inviting it, and when the house grew too tight, Bauer taught it how to breathe. The ventilation was not left to chance. It was shaped, directed, and adjusted with the seasons. Fresh air entered low, tempered by earth. Stale air exited high, carried by heat. The house inhaled and exhaled like living thing, healthy because it was intentional. These principles were not new in the 19th century. They were ancient. Indigenous builders had known them for generations. Old World masons had practiced them without naming them. Even military engineers rediscovered them under pressure, forced to protect bodies as well as buildings. What was new was how easily they were forgotten. As America industrialized, speed replaced patience. Elevation replaced anchoring. Mechanical systems replaced understanding. Basements became afterthoughts rather than foundations. Houses were sealed without being designed to breathe, or ventilated without being designed to hold warmth. We built faster, but not wiser. Johann Bauer never wrote a manual. He never claimed to invent anything. His legacy was quieter than that. It lived in a house that did not fail. When winter arrived early or stayed too long, food that lasted until spring. It lived in nights where families slept instead of stoking fires in fear. The frontier was never conquered by force alone. It was understood slowly, painfully, and by those willing to listen longer than others. Bauer listened to the land, and the land in return allowed him to stay. That is the spirit the prairie still demands from anyone who chooses to live within it. Not mastery, but partnership. Not dominance, but respect. Not fighting elements, but building in a way that lets them pass harmlessly overhead. A house that stopped the prairie from stealing heat did so not by standing taller, but by standing deeper.